In this week's Technique Tuesday, I'll demonstrate how to cable without a cable needle when 3 sets of stitches are involved in the crossing, rather than the more typical 2 sets. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. Last week, I used this swatch to demonstrate how to cable without a cable needle. Now, these are different types of cables. These are sort of standard cables that are knit with stockinette only, and you have half of the stitches are crossing the other half. Where these are traveling, this is a traveling cable where you have a rope of 2 knit stitches that travels across the background of purl stitches. What these cables have in common, regardless of the number of stitches involved in a crossing and regardless of whether the stitches are all knits or some are purls, is that the crossing involves 2 sets of stitches. So you might have 2 stitches crossing 2 stitches or 2 stitches crossing 1 stitch, but it's always 2 sets of stitches. These cables look very similar to the cables I just showed you, but the difference here is that there are 3 sets of stitches involved in these cable crossings, not 2 sets of stitches. What you see on the needles here are 2 knits on the right, a center purl, and 2 knits on the left. And what's happening in the crossing is that these 2 knit stitches are changing places with these 2 knit stitches. So the 2 sets of knit stitches are crossing each other, but that center purl stitch is maintained. So that's the 3 sets of stitches. You have 1 set is these 2 knit stitches, 1 set is just the single purl, and then the 3rd set would be the 2 that are over on the left. This type of cable is trickier to do with a cable needle or without. So let me show you at first how this is worked with a cable needle, and then I can show you how it's worked without a cable needle. So this is a left crossing cable. That means these stitches are crossing in front, and it means these 2 knit stitches are crossing in back. And the way that you would work this type of cable is to work these first 3 stitches. The 2 knits plus that center stitch are going to get slipped onto the cable needle and held to the front because it's a left crossing cable. Then the first 2 stitches to actually get knit are the ones that are furthest to the left. So those 2 stitches get worked. Then you need to work the center stitch, which is the purl. But if you look at that cable needle, the purl stitch is all the way over to the left. So what you would do if you were using a cable needle is you would slip just that purl stitch back to the left needle. Get your yarn in front to purl it. Then you would purl that stitch. So you're purling the one that's furthest to the left on the cable needle. And now you are going to purl or knit these final 2 stitches at the end. So there is an extra step where you have to rearrange that middle purl stitch before it can be worked. For the right crossing cable, it's a similar situation. Again, these are the first 2 stitches that are going to be worked, so all of the other stitches are the ones that go on the cable needle. And this time they get held to the back because these stitches are crossing the front. And again, you have that situation where you need to work the purl stitch. So you'd have to slip it off the cable needle onto the left-hand needle and let that still dangle behind. Then you could purl the stitch. And then you could knit these other stitches here. So when you are cabling without a cable needle, you want to use your working needle to capture the first set of stitches that will be worked. And that's always going to be the stitches that are furthest to the left. is when you reorder these stitches, when you're working them, when you're crossing the stitches and these two knits are exchanging places with those two knits, these are the ones that are going to be worked first. So you want to grab set number 1 first. Now this is a left crossing cable. That means these knit stitches here are going to be crossing in front to the left. That means these two stitches are going to be crossing behind. So we're going to use our working needle to come behind in order to grab those two stitches. We come behind, we come up between the purl stitch. So we come up right in between the stitches here so that we can grab those two knit stitches all the way over to the left. So I've got my working needle inserted through those two stitches. Now I'm going to pull my left needle out of all 5, but before I do that, I'm going to pinch these 3 stitches against my working needle so that they don't get lost, because they're going to be live for a second. So I'm going to take this out of all of those, and then I'm going to bring the left needle in front in order to capture all 3 of those stitches. So these are the 2 that are coming behind, and now I can put them on the needle. And now I can work just those 2 stitches. I'm going to work those first 2 stitches. Now I have the problem where I have these 3 stitches, except for the purl stitches way over here. That purl stitch needs to be knit now because it's supposed to remain between the 2 sets of knit stitches. So I'm going to be purling that. I'm going to go ahead and move my yarn to the front to be ready to purl. Once again, I'm going to come from behind because these 2 knit stitches are going to stay in front. So I'm going to come from behind to grab that purl stitch. Again, I'm going to pinch and bring the left needle in front to grab those 2 stitches, which are going to remain in front. And now I can put the purl stitch on. When I put it on, my needle is already in place to actually purl that stitch. I can purl it. And then I can finally knit these 2 stitches. So this time, these stitches over here are going to be crossing in front, not in back. So again, these are the first 2 stitches that get worked. We have these 2 stitches that get worked, and then the purl stitch gets worked, and then these 2 stitches are going to get worked. That's our 3 sets. So we're going to grab set number 1, and because it's crossing in the front, we're going to bring the working needle across the front, and we're going to grab those 2 stitches through the fronts. This time I'm going to press my index finger up against the backs of those stitches because this needle is in the way. I'm pinching both sides really, but it's important to press this. Again, these stitches remain in front, these are remaining in back. I'm pulling my needle out of all 5, and then I'm coming back to get them from behind right here. Now I can bring these 2 stitches that I've captured to the left hand needle, and I can work those 2 stitches. Again, I can bring the yarn to the front because I'm getting ready to purl. So now I'm going to grab the purl stitch, and I'm going to grab it from the front. Just like I grabbed these initial stitches from the front, I'm going to grab the purl stitch from the front, entering it as if to purl, pinching those back stitches, pulling the needle out of all 3, and then reinserting it into the 2 live stitches so that I can then reorder this and I can work it as a purl. Before I work it, you're going to note, you might notice that it looks really twisted and that something's wrong there. It's just because of the way that this is being manipulated around there. It appears to be twisted. It's not actually. It's just being pulled around. And now I can knit those last 2 stitches. So when do you come across these types of cables? Well, some designers simply choose to have a preference for this type of cable, and they'll just use it in columns of cables going up, but they can appear in other situations as well. This is an example where I was working with traveling cables and then they transitioned into these 5-stitch cables. So there was this transition point where I was working one type of cable and then I was working a different type of cable. This swatch is an example where one of those 5-stitch cables is just used a couple of places. So most of the cables have 2 sets of stitches and knits crossing purls or knits crossing knits. But right at this point where these 2 sets of ropes are crossing each other, I've got 5 stitches. So I've got 2 knits crossing over 2 knits with a purl going up the center. And it's only crossing at that one point, but it's one of those situations. So they really can occur in a variety of places. It just depends on the particular project. The cable crossings I demonstrated today involved 5 stitches. There are similar cables that involve 3 stitches with 1 stitch in each set, as well as 7 stitches. The stitches might all be knits, a mixture of knits and purls, or a mixture of twisted knits and purls. The concept is the same, regardless of what type of stitches they are, and regardless of the number of stitches in each set. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.